very warm welcome to you all. We are absolutely delighted to welcome you to Cheers celebration for LGBTQ+ History Month. We are welcoming our speaker today, Dr. Alyosxa Tudor, who is a senior lecturer in gender studies at the Centre for Gender Studies at SOAS, that's the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Why did we invite Alyosxa? Well, their rich, interdisciplinary and fastidiously theorized work connects trans and queer feminist approaches with transnational feminism and post-colonial studies. Alyosxa's publications also speak so much to a lot of Cheers research in the field of higher education studies. For example, the work on anti-normativity and the disruption and deconstruction of essentialized identity binaries, to social and epistemic exclusion. And Alyosxa has done some wonderful work on the marginalized, stigmatized minorities, such as the European Roma, which articulates with the Heim project in CHEER about the Roma in European higher education. It's also around the troubling of racialized, gendered, heteronormative logics within neoliberalized academic institutions. Alyosxa also looks at decolonization in incredible detail and depth, and the subterranean effective economy of border and boundary crossing, internationalization. Alyosxa's most recent work is on challenging, deconstructing, and reframing the field of transgender studies, with a focus on epistemology, pedagogy, and analysis of public media discourses in the face of the global right, a topic that is hugely relevant to recent assaults on democracy in diverse geopolitical locations. The world needs Alyosxa's erudition, and we are delighted to welcome them today to present the lecture, Decolonizing Transgender Studies, Teaching Gender, Race, and Sexuality in Times of the Rise of the Global Right. Over to you, Alyosxa, and a very, very warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Louise, and thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you, Yasser, for being the contact person. I'm really, really excited to be here. I'm just a few words before I start. So all my degrees are in gender studies, so I'm basically in a way an academic product of gender studies, but also, of course, that means I have shaped the discipline in certain ways, like in various locations. And that's why when I started looking at these global attacks on gender studies, the thing that really in the scholarship bothered me was the missing links from the attacks on gender studies globally that we can see, and transphobic feminism. And I wondered, how is it possible that gender studies get attacked with this kind of these feminists, these queer people, and so on, right? With this kind of anti-feminist, anti-queer approach. And at the same time, there were transphobic feminists using the same arguments in a way against trans people. And so I wanted to look into that. And then also I wanted to carve out the overlap again with attacks against the Decolonizing the Curriculum movement in the UK. And so that's how the paper came together. So Decolonizing Transgender Studies, ? Teaching Gender, Race, and Sexuality in Times of the Rise of the Global Right. I have some slides for you. Can you see that, and can you hear me properly? Cool.
Yes.
Yes, cool. In this talk, I argue that a decolonial perspective on gender means conceptualizing the category of gender as always already trans. My object of investigation is gender as a category and gender studies as a field of knowledge. In order to discuss what decolonizing transgender studies, trans/gender studies mean, in the global north could mean, I aim to bring different strands together that have been held apart so far. Resistance against global attacks on gender studies, resistance against transphobic feminism, and the Decolonizing the Curriculum movement in the UK. So this is just to give you a little bit of like images of the 3 fields that I want to bring together, and mainly on the attacks on them. In the first part of the paper, I revisit global anti-gender attacks in the context of the rise of the global right from a decolonial and trans perspective. Trans as in both transgender and transnational. Bringing an explicitly transgender-focused perspective to the debate, I analyze transphobic feminist attacks on both trans people and gender studies that call themselves gender critical or radical feminist, and show that they're aligned with masculinist, anti-gender, and far-right anti-immigration rhetoric. Moreover, acknowledging the role binary and heteronormative gender plays in right-wing discourse, I argue that Western gender studies need to address questions of borders, Eurocentrism, colonialism, and racism in order to investigate their own understanding of gender as a category. As I will show, this will always lead to thinking gender studies as part of the epistemological project of decolonizing academic knowledge production. In the second part of the talk, I bring these thoughts together with the Decolonizing the Curriculum movement in the UK. At British universities, a mostly student-led movement has started to emerge that fights for decolonizing higher education. While this movement is inspired by transnational student activism, like Rhodes and Fees Must Fall in South Africa, and calls for challenging racist, colonialist, nationalist, and neoliberal paradigms in knowledge production by addressing both issues of epistemology and access to higher education, it has mostly been distorted in media representation as misguided identity politics. Applying central political claims of the Decolonizing the Curriculum movement, I explore potentials and challenges of the task of decolonizing transgender studies, trans/gender studies in the global north. With this, my intervention opens up a discussion on how to conceptualize knowledge on transgender with a central focus on decolonial and transnational perspectives. Furthermore, I see the attacks on the decolonizing movement as part of global attacks on emancipatory fields of knowledge production like gender studies and queer and trans feminist scholarship. This implies that meaningful resistance against anti-gender argumentations needs also to adopt a decolonial perspective. So how can we make sense of the paradox that anti-gender is often an attack on feminism, while some feminists attack trans people under the label gender critical? How can we come up with strategies to counter the claim of many anti-feminist, queer and transphobic anti-gender argumentations in the global south and in Eastern Europe that gender is a Western concept that colonizes non-Western, authentic understandings of proper sex and sexuality? In which ways can decolonizing be a project that does not just absorb and depoliticize the term? How can decolonizing transgender studies not fall into the trap of simply appropriating transnational, non-Western, or anti-racist approaches around the world in 80 genders, as Susan Stryker ironically names these exotizations, but how can it generate meaningful epistemological engagements? Part 1, overlaps of anti-gender and transphobic gender critical rhetoric. In recent years, right-wing discourse globally has targeted gender studies, feminism, and LGBT rights using affirmatively anti-gender and anti-genderism for themselves and accuse their targets of gender ideology. Especially the latter term assumes that gender studies and queer and trans and feminist movements produce an ideology that attacks and opposes the majority of the population, while heterosexuality and a stable gender binary are seen as unideological and natural. So we can see here Sonia Correa's work, for example, David Paternotte, Roman Kuhar, Sarah Bracken, Sabine Hark, for example. The landscape of gender studies bashing we're looking at is complex. Nationalist and religious agents like the Pope or Brazil's far-right president play a part in it alongside religious, conservative and far-right publics opposing gay marriage, feminism and women's rights. They reaffirm the importance of assuming and perpetuating a stable sex-gender alignment, with often overlapping but sometimes competing argumentations. Gender as a concept is demonized as feminist or anti-feminist, as colonizing or a post-colonial deconstruction gone too far, as unscientific or a secular attack on the traditional family, as misguided identity politics, or as destroying proper natural identities. Often emancipatory analysis of power relations that are rooted exactly in the fields of post-colonial, queer, trans, and feminist studies and anti-fascist traditions of thought get appropriated and used in twisted ways. Feminists are called feminazis, and the attackers often see their freedom in danger or construct themselves as the people's voice against elitist gender studies or feminist dictatorship, as Bracke and Partenotte point out. Repetitive claims can be found in supranational anti-gender argumentations that are often tied to religion and or to nationalisms and insist on the traditional family values and a natural sex-gender alignment. Separating gender from sex, so the story goes, and indeed inventing gender as a flexible concept endangers the truth of the body and biology, and with this puts the unquestionably heterosexual family and the nation in danger. Some see gender studies as a pedophile sexualization of children, as an attempt to rip people of their natural identities as men and women, as either unscientific or blasphemy. Anti-gender voices often construct themselves as the marginal ones and or the oppressed or the vulnerable. Meanwhile, as Sarah Bracke and David Partenotte note, the Catholic Church associates gender ideology with ISIS and constructs itself with reference to its Latin American Pope as a post-colonial church for the people that promotes religious freedom. What is important to pin down here is the apparent paradox that some strands of feminism join the anti-gender choir led by the Catholic Church, populist politicians, and right-wing or conservative publics, which complicates the question of the relationship between gender studies and feminism. Elaborating more on this last point, I will show that to understand properly attacks on gender studies and feminism, we need to draw to connections to transphobic attacks on trans people in the name of feminism that accuse gender and gender studies of harming women. And at the same time, we need to tackle racist and migrantist discourses that often come together with these argumentations. As a concrete example, I turn to recent incidents of lesbian and feminist transphobia in order to point out that this phenomenon uses the same vocabulary and logics as far-right anti-gender argumentation. While the latter openly attacks feminists and queer people, and within this, of course, lesbians, some lesbians and feminists eagerly use the same strategy to attack trans people, queer and trans theory, and this is a sign that the fight is epistemological, post-structuralism. Moreover, as I will argue, we can witness an overlap of transphobic positions with misogyny, racism, and migrantism, a simplistic focus on sexual violence, and a rewriting of feminism as a single-issue politics project. Let me be clear in outlining the tensions and paradoxes here. We're dealing with anti-gender attacks that target gender studies and feminists. And at the same time, we're confronted with transphobic attacks that target gender studies and trans people in the name of feminism. The latter explicitly thinks of itself as gender critical feminism. This means feminist transphobia as a phenomenon that can be seen as a specific conjuncture of anti-genderism. A prominent lesbian feminist example that explicitly combines transphobia with attacks on gender studies is Sheila Jeffrey's book Gender Hurts. Written as a polemic rant, she claims that both trans people and gender studies scholars reproduce essentialist concepts of gender. This accusation is utterly problematic, of course, given the fact that Jeffrey's approach relies on sex as a biological, eternal, and universal category. Gender studies, queer theory, and post-structuralism, in Jeffrey's view, are responsible for all sorts of attacks on feminism. They have overwhelmed feminism, have made gender into a movable feast, have assaulted feminism, and have always been in opposition to lesbian feminism. Jeffries mourns the disappearance of the category lesbian, which he thinks to have been given up by young women in favor of genderqueer, and blames gender studies for this phenomenon as some sort of brainwashing program to strip lesbians of their stable female lesbian identity. Feminist transphobia is a widespread discourse with academic and public dimensions. Recent incidents like the transphobic intervention in the name of lesbians at the 2018 London Pride Let me just go into this. This is the leaflet. Suggests that lesbian/dykes and trans positions are politically oppositional, mutually exclusive, and antagonistic. However, many of us queer feminists, lesbian feminists, and trans feminists know from our struggles, positionalities, and politics that lesbian, dyke, femme, butch, trans, non-binary can be seen as overlapping, interconnected, and in complex interaction with one another. With an explicit focus on sexual violence, the transphobic leaflet distributed by the lesbian group Get the L Out at London Pride claimed to oppose rape culture and see lesbians erased through the existence of trans people. The reference to sexual violence is not new. It has been a strategy of feminist and lesbian transphobia for a while. We can think of Janice Raymond's vicious attack on trans people and specifically on Sandy Stone in 1978, in which Raymond states that trans women, I quote, rape women's bodies by reducing the real female to an artifact, end of quote. The recurring topos of externalizing sexual violence, ascribing it to the pervert other, is shared in transphobic, Islamophobic, migratist, and racist debates. It is the idea sexual violence takes place somewhere else and will be invited into the white Western nation state through migration and weak border controls. I argue that this allows for a displaced debate on sexual violence instead of addressing it in the realm of the normative, where it actually regularly happens without the need of importing it from the outside. What is interesting about these externalizations is that they come in complex crossfadings, in ever-shifting shapes that require shifting forms of resistance. For example, Islamophobic ideas of Muslim men as the sexual perpetrator can come in the form of homo and transnationalism, in Poir's term, in the name of protecting vulnerable queer and trans people from queer and transphobia imported from the imagined outside of the nation. While in transphobic narratives, it is vulnerable women or lesbians that need to be protected from trans people. While right-wing anti-gender polemics in the style of Brazil's Bolsonaro attack feminist, trans, and queer people alike and explicitly deny the existence of sexual violence against women, self-proclaimed so-called gender-critical feminists use simplistic understandings of sexual violence as the master argument of their transphobia. It becomes clear both transphobic feminists and far-right and religious argumentations are concerned with alignment of sex and gender. With this, transphobic feminists do not only copy the language of far-right discourse, but actually are part of far-right discourse. As a response to lesbian feminist transphobia, Sandy Stone in 1987 explains attacks on trans women as, I quote, morality tales an origin myth about telling the truth of gender, end of quote. Reproducing similar ideas about the truth of the sexed body, in a recent post, the UK-based group Mayday for Women claims, and so this is what you see here underlined in red, transgenderism is currently one of the biggest threats to feminism in the UK. This supposedly radical feminist rhetoric overlaps with religious anti-gender rants, like, for example, uttered by the Pope or the Spanish Cardinal Canizares Llobera, who sees gender ideology as the biggest threat to humanity. So I think it's really striking that the vocabulary is really overlapping here. Most of these transphobic and anti-gender studies incidents unite in attacking Judith Butler's gender trouble. That's what we also saw on the first image, if you remember, that was in Brazil, an attack on Judith Butler when they gave a paper there. And it's also interesting, the devil's horns, so the equation that was made on that protest placard. They unite in attacking Judith Butler's gender trouble, in which she questions a stable subject of feminism and critically investigates women as an absolute and essential category. And with this shows that sex has always been gender. Rather than a social role attached on top of a natural body, it is conventionalizations of gender that make sex appear to be a pre-given stable category. This insight, and maybe it should not come as a surprise, still seems to be so radical that it's not only for the Catholic Church the biggest threat, threat to humanity, but also for some feminists, the biggest threat to feminism. While the first position ties ideas of humanness back to the binary opposition of Western Enlightenment, which is a paradox, as Enlightenment actually claims to be a secular break from religious beliefs, feminists in the latter ironically tie feminism to the cementation of exactly that binary opposition of sex embodiment. With this in mind, it is my argument that we need to extend the focus to the explicitly feminist attacks on trans people and in trans and queer feminist knowledge production if we take the endeavor seriously to analyze global anti-feminist attacks on gender studies. It does not come as a surprise then that in January 2019 in the US, a group of radical feminists appeared at a panel titled "The Inequality of the Equality Act, Concerns from the Left" at an event of the Heritage Foundation, a conservative right-wing organization which has a long history of lobbying against LGBTQ rights and serves as a think tank that advocates against feminism and gender theory. Moreover, the organization is strongly anti-immigration, of course. I can show you here the anti-immigration stance. So that's the panel from the left. So of course, the question, if you read that anti-immigration stance on the webpage, one would really be concerned about the understanding of coming from the left while still participating in that conference. Openly anti-feminist, the foundation proclaims on its website that the sex-gender distinction is a cultural war that can be traced back to the second feminist wave that interrupts, I quote, "the confidence in the very idea of man and woman, end of quote, and destroys the family." On the website of the foundation, Scott Yenner, a right-wing political scientist, explicitly states, I quote, so you have the quote here on the slide, "Transgender theories are part of the feminist goal of a sexual revolution that eliminates the family and celebrates non-monogamous sexual experiences," end of quote. What do we make of a self-proclaimed leftist feminist participating in an event organized by such an openly anti-feminist, anti-immigration think tank? Moreover, and maybe more importantly, I find myself agreeing with the analysis of the anti-gender rant that can be found off the foundation's webpage, that trans theories are a project born out of feminism. Let me read that again. "Transgender theories are part of the feminist goal of a sexual revolution that eliminates the family and celebrates non-monogamous sexual experiences," end of quote. Hell yes. Indeed, I could not have put it better in words. So what do we do with the fact that I'm ready to admit that this is exactly what I think gender studies are, a project to eliminate the heterosexual, sexist, capitalist family, to undo the categories of men and women, to celebrate desire and pleasure, and to tear down racist nationalisms. Gender studies in their best form really do have the potential to be worse than the worst conservative nightmare. And I think that's really interesting that we have here the proclaimed right-winger getting these connections better than the people who call themselves feminists who intervene in this. A further example of the twisted argumentations in the anti-gender debates, further example of the twisted argumentations in the anti-gender debates, some strands of anti-gender bashing in the global South and Eastern Europe see gender studies, feminism, and LGBT rights as a colonizing import from the West, as for example, Kapia Kaoma points out. Very often this idea is perpetuated by the Catholic Church and the Pope. Bracke and Partenot underline that, I quote, "this post-colonial discourse positions the global South in general and Africa in particular as a location where family locations are both more authentic and more in line with Catholic doctrine," end of quote. While they open up important points, Bracke and Partenot do not fully elaborate on the implications of the use of post-colonial here. We need to be clear that the Catholic Church appropriates the term post-colonial. In fact, Catholic officials suggest that the modern binary heteronormative sex-gender system, and with it homophobia, that was important through colonialism, imported through colonialism, as many approaches show, for example, Carby 1982 and Lugones 2007, amongst many others, is an authentic non-Western one. Christian missionaries and international right-wing Christian money flows, as Kauma shows, play an important role in stabilizing the colonial sex, gender, sexuality nexus in the global South. Therefore, it is more than hypocritical to claim the post-colonial position as inherent to the Catholic Church. However, while joining Kauma in criticizing the simplistic Christian propaganda, how can a decolonized gender studies project avoid to fall into the trap of understanding the critique of gender as a neocolonial or colonial category as a call for a return to an imagined pre-colonial gender-free or non-homophobic authenticity? As Rahul Rao points out, liberal studies like Kauma's titled Colonizing African Values, How the US Christian Right is Transforming Sexual Politics in Africa, offer, I quote Rao, a valuable corrective to the neo-Orientalist view of an essential and irredeemable African homophobia, end of quote. While at the same time, as Rao makes clear, problematically construct both African religious leaders and publics as operated by Western remote control without the capacity of own agendas beyond colonial/neo-colonial power. With these twists in mind, in the next subsection, I will investigate what a post-colonial, decolonial understanding of gender as a concept might entail, and in which ways this understanding destabilizes the very category of gender and therefore bears the potential of transing it. With this, I aim to discuss what decolonizing transgender studies could mean. That's why the question mark there is, because it's a question mark, right? What could it mean? Not what does it mean? Are you all with me? Are you happy? I can't properly see you, so I'm just going to continue. Part 2, decolonizing the curriculum, question mark. A lot of the UK media representation on decolonizing the curriculum movement is hostile. Not only the right-wing press, but also the liberals are outraged and accuse the movement of essentialism, anti-male, anti-white, and anti-Western resentments, and even racism. Knowledge, so the story goes, is neutral and gets deneutralized and re-racialized through the decolonizing movement. It is actually the white English people who are the colonized, and the imposition of decolonizing is the actual colonialism. The scholars who are used to anti-gender argumentations, these accusations will seem very familiar. Decolonizing higher education is not only a question of representation, but a broader project that looks at issues of representation, access, epistemology alike, as for example, Bambra et al. And Sabaratnam carve out. And I think we can't underline that enough. It is the students, especially the student-led interventions, like for example, at SOAS, Cambridge and Goldsmith, are often radically intersectional. In many cases, they're founded and sustained by women, queer, trans of color, migratized and working class students who point out the complex overlaps of racism and migratism with other power relations and connect epistemology and representation with questions of access and non-access to higher education. In relation to the South African movement, Khadija Khan remarks that, I quote, Black queer women and non-binary people are creating both epistemological and material possibilities for expanding liberation, end of quote. As I want to stress, it is mainly the students whose intervention assure and maintain the radical character of the decolonizing the curriculum. For example, radical residency. So I will go into this now. A SOAS student group that in 2018, during the UK-wide lecturer strike over pensions, squatted an empty building of the British Museum, only a few blocks away from SOAS, and converted it temporarily into a social center. They not only supported their striking lecturers and suffered extended verbal and physical abuse for their activism, but also put on the table broader questions of knowledge production, radical democracy, and on the connection between discrimination, dispossession, and resistance. So building on these interventions, what happens to the category of gender, to the question what gender even is, and with this, what transing gender could be and could mean, if we take the commitment seriously to decolonize higher education and to challenge the Eurocentric and white canon. This endeavor can indeed be challenging in terms of how to teach new or relatively less cited work, how to translate concepts and terms, and how to engage with the traveling or the non-traveling of theories. I will start with a quite obvious claim. Many feminist, queer, trans, and critical race approaches make clear that the concept of sex gender is a colonial one. This means we cannot even understand what gender is if we do not investigate the ways in which it is constructed through racialization. This groundbreaking challenge to gender as a category opens up various ways of transing. I argue that it actually makes it hard to think of gender studies as not always already trans, as in transing gender, transnational, and in translation. At the same time, it points towards understanding the relation of cisgender to transgender as a much more complex one than a simplistic binary approach that does not take racialization and transnational translation of concepts into account. Through investigating the role of racialization for the emergence of gender, it becomes clear that colonial ideas of gender rely on the fact of having a gender, being one of two genders, as necessary for being recognized as human. Hortense Spillers theorizes how slavery ungenders, in Spiller's term, both men and women, how it takes away whatever form of gender had been relevant within the African societies the enslaved were taken from. Building on this thought, C. Riley Snorton carves out that trans identity, the fungibility of gender, has a racial history. With this in mind, it becomes evident that it is different to transgender, go beyond gender, so transgender, if that means go beyond gender, if you already have a gender or are a gender, then transing gender from a position of contested gender, ungender. This also shows the importance of gender in global discussions and why seemingly different positioned figures like transphobic feminists, the Pope, conservative publics, or neo-Nazis are invested in stabilizing and holding on to normative gender. But it also means something for theorizing transgender. A scholar and activist who engages the dimensions of decolonial nationalism and complexities of oppression and resistance in anti-colonial and state-critical movements is Stella Nyanzi. Thinking Together Colonialism, Ugandan Post-Colonial Nationalism and Queer and Transphobia, in her article on HIV/AIDS prevention in post-conflict Uganda, Nyanzi analyzes how sexual and gendered minorities and refugees are often excluded from official AIDS/HIV prevention programs. Especially those in displacement are hit by the overlapping regimes of sexual morality, state violence, and the heightened exposure to gender and sexual violence, illness, and death. So you can see here a quote from Nyanzi's 2013 piece. Building on Nyanzi's approach, I suggest to extract a political and epistemological claim for decolonized and transnational trans/gender studies, and for countering both anti-immigration and transphobic argumentations. Nyanzi remarks that the refugee-run, self-organized support group, Les Sens, that aims to fill the gap the official sexual health providers in Uganda leave, uses vacheche as a common denominator, which is, as Nyanzi states, a colloquial label for sex workers and same-sex loving or gender non-conforming people in Uganda. End of quote. With this, Nyanzi offers a theoretical and epistemological intervention in transphobic and anti-sex work feminisms that operate as single-issue politics. Let's imagine for a moment the term vacheche would come to have an international career like political and identity-based concepts like lesbian or trans, or epistemological and political traditions of thought like queer with origins in the US. What would vacheche theory help us to understand about the entanglement of non-normative genders and sexualities and their connection to racialization and migrant status, about the violence of colonialism and of the decolonial or Western nationalism alike? As it becomes clear with the fluid conceptualization of gender and sexual non-normativity, Wedzieck's studies are not only fiercely anti-nationalist, like indeed Nancy herself, they also intervene in lesbian transphobia and rigid cis-trans binaries. Wedzieck's studies make anti-trans and anti-sex work approaches inconceivable, as their subjects balance on the overlaps of non-normative, amoral, and abject sex and gender. Even if the term is colloquially not necessarily used as critical of the state and its borders, Nancy certainly introduces it in that way in her knowledge production. This form of anti-nationalist resistance means at the moment, in our current situation, if we take the anti-nationalism really out of this approach and the need for anti-nationalism, in our current situation in the global north, that approaches that are so really interested in tackling gender and sexual violence need to centrally take into account how border regimes make women, lesbians, trans, queer, and non-binary people, sex workers or not, highly vulnerable to violence. Of course, it is not immigration that is the problem, but nationalism, white supremacy, and the highly policed borders that require risky border crossings. This insight turns investigating, criticizing, and opposing border regimes into a key topic for gender studies, especially for strands of gender studies that are concerned about violence. In line with scholars like Alyosxa Camacho, Ethne Lupaid, and Stella Nancy, amongst others, I agree that it is crucial to analyze border industries as relying on and stabilizing violent gender and sexual regimes. As Schmidt-Camacho makes clear, to understand, I quote, gender violence as a central feature of both nation formation and capitalist development, rather than seeing it as an expression of their failure, end of quote, means that any approach on gender and sexual violence needs to address the violence of the nation state and its regulatory regimes, like borders, migration laws, deportations, detention centers, etc. Western nation states are based on capitalist border industries in which the people trying to cross these borders are seen as being made for suffering and being killed. To be clear, I'm not making the point on Wedzieck's studies in order to argue we should replace queer, lesbian, or trans with Wedzieck, but in order to remind us of the traveling or non-traveling of these terms and the variability of the dominant meaning that is attached to them. The meaning that gets lost in translation, that meaning that doesn't even get transferred, the meaning that is unseen and is ignored, as also Matabeni and Mizipi in 2015 underline. Bringing all these thoughts back to transgender studies / gender studies, it becomes clear that gender is a contested concept and needs to be dramatically deconstructed every time we use it. Applying a conventionalized English language term, I suggest therefore to understand decolonized gender studies as always already trans. Transing, going beyond the category, deconstructing a category, can do the work of creating solidarity and at the same time challenge borders and boundaries with respect to nation and migration. Additionally, transgender demands for transnation, for fiercely anti-nationalist, anti-colonial politics and knowledge productions. How can dominant ways of doing gender studies be criticized and interrupted? In other words, how can gender, queer, and trans studies teachers and scholars based in the global north make sure that gender studies do not hurt through either being a racism ignorant and methodologically nationalist monolithic field, or engaging in wanting to save women, queer, and trans people elsewhere, or through randomly appropriating knowledge productions from the global south or marginalized contexts? Moreover, how can we prevent that the decolonizing movement becomes neoliberal academia's next buzzword, emptied of any critical content? And what to do with the already beginning tendencies of institutions trying to make decolonizing the curriculum into a brand to attract student consumers? I see the endeavor of decolonizing higher education as multi-layered and necessarily as a collective process that pays attention to gaps, overlaps, contradictions, and differently positioned complicities. Complicities is a really important word here. In my view, what becomes clear is that any decolonization must bridge diaspora studies with approaches from the global south, connect indigenous studies with migration studies, and centrally must question the paradigm of the nation state. Moreover, feminist, queer, and trans perspectives and their deconstructions of gender and sexuality are crucial for decolonizing epistemologies and spaces. So decolonizing the curriculum is certainly not grounded and cannot be grounded in nationalist respectability. This means it's not enough to just refer back to anti-racist knowledge productions from the global north that intervene in the racialized premises of the Western nation states. Nevertheless, this undertaking, in my view, is still crucial for teaching transgender studies / gender studies in the global north. At the same time, transnational knowledge productions, especially from the global south, need to be part of a decolonized curriculum. What is challenging, however, especially for scholars positioned in critical European studies and privileged by whiteness, like me, for example, is how to find these knowledge productions and how to actually use them in ways that are not appropriating. While my approach stresses the importance to go beyond, especially this is also an intervention in US-centric trans studies, US-centric knowledge production, it is important to keep in mind that intervening from a European perspective in US scholarly dominance and methodological nationalism obviously cannot mean recentering Europe instead or mourn its seemingly peripheral state in comparison to the US. However, what I really think is striking about knowledge production in the US on transnational, even explicitly that are labeled as transnational, is that the transnational only gets visible when it enters the US. Right, so basically what very often is meant by transnational is the knowledge production of people who have posts in the US working on transnational context, right? But it only becomes visible when it enters the US. And I think that is really a problem that we also have to look at in the UK context, obviously. One claim I would like to make, it is that any inclusion of new knowledge production, be it queer or trans or challenging the Western canon, or all of this, ideally, depends on putting a lot of work into reading and getting familiar with the field. In order to avoid what Kurman, Drabinsky, and Malatino in relation to trans inclusion into the women's studies canon call a special guest approach, a decolonized transnational and trans and queer feminist gender studies curriculum ideally challenges paradigms of knowledge production and not simply works with add-ons. It is not enough to assign that one text that is the easiest to get hold of and make it into the authentic example, as Tak and Yang also underline. For example, Bibi Bakare Yusuf points out in which ways Oriyonke Oyewumi's claim that the Yorubas don't do gender is based on heteronormative assumption on what gender and its relation to language is. Yet it is still Oyewumi's approach that ends up on the syllabi in order to introduce the authentic African position. Queer feminists and trans scholars like Setu Matabeni, B. Kaminga, Stella Niansi, and Bibi Bakare Yusuf intervene in the heteronormative idea of pre-colonial gender-free and with this sexism and homo and transphobia-free utopia, and at the same time point out in which ways Western concepts of gender rights and development are problematic and reproducing of colonial hierarchies. When it comes to analyzing these complexities, Rahul Rao's knowledge production makes us sit with the contradictions and refuses simplistic answers that either romanticize or demonize the global South while trying to deconstruct what he calls the location of homophobia. Furthermore, Avino Okej underlies how important it is to assign African feminist knowledge production not only for teaching focused on Africa, but as generalist expertise in gender and queer studies. To bring these insights back to the transgender studies syllabus, to the gender studies syllabus, it becomes clear that one cannot pick and single out knowledge productions and put them as add-ons to the one's curriculum, but one needs to become familiar with the whole field and the complex discussions and contradictory approaches within it. As I have argued, a transnational critical perspective on both gender and anti-gender, and also on feminist transphobia, leads to the question how to decolonize Western gender studies within a broader project of decolonizing higher education. However, as colonization and the knowledge productions derived through it have existed for centuries, it would be naive to think that decolonizing can be achieved swiftly through the voluntary acts of a few scholars. So that's why there is this question mark, and I think we cannot take the question mark away, really. The points offered in this paper, as I would hope, do not only point out that there is no thinking about the question what gender is without investigating the role of racism, colonialism, and nationalism for the emergence of gender. They also provide an important argument for decolonizing the curriculum. We need to decolonize transgender studies, gender studies, if we want to begin to learn to understand what their subject even is. Moreover, it is precisely gender studies and queer and trans feminist approaches that can give the decolonizing movement an important theoretical foundation. And this is unfortunately not very often acknowledged in UK knowledge production and decolonizing higher education. Decolonizing transgender studies is necessarily a collective process that cannot be done individually. It also means to link attacks on gender studies with attacks on broader movements like the decolonizing movement, transnational feminist, anti-fascist, anti-racist, and anti-colonial struggles. In line with many approaches that analyze attacks on gender studies, I think it's important to understand the phenomenon as connected to the global rise of the far right. However, it becomes clear that we also urgently need to pay attention to feminist anti-gender argumentations, or to put it the other way around, pay attention to the way in which some feminisms are racist, oppressive, and right-wing, even if they claim not to be. In this paper, I suggested that thinking these strands together calls for a challenge of paradigms in queer and trans and feminist pedagogies and epistemologies, and a commitment to understanding gender studies as always already trans in multiple ways. Both the endeavors of countering anti-gender and transphobic attacks and decolonizing transgender studies require ongoing deconstructions of the category of gender and an analysis that sees transgender and gender as always already defined through racialization, post-colonial geopolitics, colonial geopolitics, transnational movements, and translation. Thank you.